Hello and welcome back to 64 Squares Official. Today we look at a fascinating second round battle from the 2026 Sinquefield Cup in St. Louis, where India's Grandmaster Praggnanandhaa, rated 2750, faced Uzbekistan's Grandmaster Javokhir Sindarov, rated 2777. Both are amongst the strongest young players in the world, and this game turned into an extraordinary battle of strategy, rook activity, and an incredibly tense endgame. So now let's jump into the game. d4 and d5, c4 and e6. Pragg starts with the Queen's Gambit, while Sindarov chooses the solid Queen's Gambit declined. Now knight to c3 and bishop to e7. Captures. Pragg exchanges in the center, leaving black with an isolated looking but playable pawn structure. A bishop to f4, a knight to f6, e3 and a bishop to f5. Both sides develop naturally. White's bishop on f4 is particularly active. Now h3, preventing any bishop to g4 ideas. And c6, white prepares to expand on the king side while black reinforces the center. Now g4, attacking the bishop. Now bishop goes g6 and h4 and h6. Now h5, attacking the bishop, and bishop retreats to h7. An ambitious sequence for Pragg. He gains considerable space and forces the bishop all the way back to h7. A bishop to d3 and knight b to d7. Knight g to e2 and knight to f8. Both sides continue developing. Black prepares to reroute the knight towards e6. Now bishop takes h7. And knight 6 takes h7. Pragg gives up his bishop for black's bishop. Black recaptures with the knight, keeping the position balanced. Now queen to c2 and knight to e6. Bishop to e5, and Sindarov goes for kingside castling. White places the queen aggressively and improves the bishop. Black safely castles. Now Pragg castles long and a5. King to b1 and rook to e8. Opposite side castling makes the position interesting. Pragg moves his king away from the c-file while Sindarov activates his rook. Now knight to g3. This is a small inaccuracy. e4 was stronger, immediately challenging black's center. Now f6, attacking the bishop on e5. Bishop goes f4 and knight takes f4 and e takes f4. Black challenges the bishop and exchanges the knight. White accepts double structural weaknesses but gains the open e-file. Now bishop to d6. And knight c to e2 and queen to c7, putting pressure on the f4 pawn. Now knight to f5 and rook to e6. Pragg centralizes his knight on f5. Black's rook becomes active on the 6th rank. Now knight takes d6 and queen takes. White exchanges a strong knight for black's bishop. The position remains approximately equal. Now queen to d2, supporting the pawn, and queen to b4. A questionable decision from Sindarov. f5 was more accurate. Now queen takes and a takes. Pragg immediately trades queens. Black is left with double b pawns, but white's advantage is still modest. Now knight to g3, knight to f8, rook to d3 and rook e to e8. The rooks become active. White prepares to swing the rook across the 3rd rank. Now rook to b3, attacking the pawn, and rook to a4, knight to f5. Pragg's knight returns to f5, putting pressure on black's position. Now rook to e4, attacking the pawn. Now rook to e3. If black takes, then white can promote his rook and create more threats. So now a rook takes and f takes. The rooks are exchanged. White gets a more active pawn structure, while black's knight remains an important defensive piece. Now knight to e6, knight to d6, attacking the pawn, and a rook to a7. The knight becomes the key pieces. White's knight reaches d6 and restrict black's position. Now rook to e1, trying to promote the e4 pawn, and king to f8 and e4. Pragg starts pushing his central pawn majority. Now rook to a8. Now e takes d5 and knight takes f4. Now captures. White creates a passed pawn, but black eliminates it. The position remains difficult to convert. Now king to c2 and g6. The king becomes increasingly important as the game transitions fully into the endgame. Now h take g6, another inaccuracy from Pragg. A rook to e4 was the best move. This would have kept greater pressure. Now king to g7 and rook to e7 check, and king takes g6. Black's king becomes very active and captures the pawn. Now knight to f5, trying for rook to g7 checkmate. So now a rook to g8 and rook to c7, attacking the pawn on c6. Now king to g5, attacking the pawn, and rook takes c6. Pragg wins another pawn, but black has enough activity to keep the position under control. Now rook to d8, keeping an eye on the e4 pawn. Now rook to c5 and knight to e6, attacking the rook. Now rook goes b5, attacking the pawn. Now king takes g4. Black's king goes pawn hunting. White's rook remains active on the 5th rank. Now knight takes h6 with check. Now king goes f3 and rook takes b4. Pragg collects another pawn. Material is becoming increasingly important, but black's active pieces compensate. Now knight takes d4 with a check. King to c3 and knight to e2 check. King to c4 and king e4. Black's knight gives repeated checks while the king penetrates deep into white's position. Now rook to b6, attacking the pawn. Now rook to c8 check. Now king goes b4 and knight to f4. If white takes the f6 pawn, then knight to d5. White will then lose the rook. The game becomes a fascinating rook and knight battle. Neither side can force progress. Now king to b3 and knight to d5, attacking the rook on b6. Now rook to e6 check. Now king to d3. Pragg keeps checking from behind while black's king searches for shelter. Now a3 and rook to b8 check. Now king goes a2 and rook to b5. White begins advancing the queenside pawns while black's rooks stay active. Now rook to c6 and rook to a5. The idea here is to play knight to b4 check and win the rook because white cannot play a takes b4. So king retreats to b1 and king to e4 and rook to c4 check and king to d3. More checks. Black's king oscillates between d3 and e4. Now rook goes c6 and king to e4, knight to f7 and rook a7. Now knight to d6 check and king to e5. Pragg uses his knight to control key squares while the rook keeps checking. Now knight to b5, attacking the rook. Now rook goes h7. Now rook to c5 and king to e4. Rook to c4 check and king goes e5. Pragg uses his knight to control key squares while the rook keeps checking. Now rook to c5 and king to e4. Rook c4 check and king to e5. Knight to d4 and rook to h3. White improves the knight, but black's rook remains active enough to hold. Now knight to c6 check, king to d6. Now knight to b4 and knight to e3, attacking the rook. This is the first major defensive mistake. Rook to h1 check was the suggested move. This was the better way to continue. Now rook to c6 check and king to e5, supporting the pawn. Knight to d3 check and king to d4. Rook to d6 check, supporting the knight as well, and king to c4. Pragg immediately exploits the weakened position with a series of checks. Now knight to f2, attacking the rook. Pragg misses a stronger option with knight to f4, allowing black to remain in the fight. Now rook to f3, attacking, knight to e4 and f5. Knight to d2 check, at the same time attacking the rook. Now king to c5, black pushes the f pawn and tries to create counterplay. Now rook to d3 and rook to h3, king to a2 and f4, b4 check and king to c6. White advances the queenside pawns, but black's king remains active. Now king to b3, rook to h5, now knight to c4 and knight to d5, a4 and rook to g5. Both sides maneuver carefully. White's pass pawn potentially is becoming more dangerous. Now knight to d2 and rook to g3, knight to f3 and knight to e3. And here comes the blunder. Sindarov should have played a rook to g8, but knight to e3 allows white's knight to take over the position. Instead of knight to f3 on move 82, there was an interesting continuation if white played a b5 check and king to d6, knight to e4 check and king to e6, knight takes g3. But instead of king to d6, if black played king to b6, then king to c4, knight to e3 check, king to b4, knight to c2 check, king to c4 and knight to e3 check, king to d4, knight to c2 check, king to e4 and knight to b4. So after the blunder knight to e3, Pragg plays knight to d4 check and king to d5, knight to e2 check, a discovered check and king to e4. Pragg immediately finds the correct sequence, forcing black's king around. Now rook to d8 and rook to f3, another mistake. Rook to g4 offered better resistance. Now knight to c3 check, king to e5 and a5. Now the a pawn becomes extremely dangerous. Now rook to f1 and a6, rook to a1 and b5. Now f3. Black races his f pawn down the board, hoping counterplay will save the game. Now rook to e8 check, king goes d4, rook to e4 check, king to c5, rook to f4, attacking the pawn, a knight to d5, attacking the rook. Now rook to f5, a brilliant move. Pragg keeps the black king under pressure while preparing to stop the pawn. Now f2 and a7. Instead of a7, if white takes the pawn, the knight takes c3, king takes c3, king takes b5, rook to f6, then captures, black captures, and the game will end in a draw. So instead of rook takes f2, white plays a7, a brilliant move, and the black pawn queens. Now rook takes f1, black finally promotes, but Pragg has seen the tactic. The newly promoted queen is immediately captured. An extraordinary endgame victory for Pragg. The game was essentially balanced for a huge stretch, with players demonstrating remarkable defensive technique. The decisive moment came with knight to e3, after which Pragg's knight, rook and passed a pawn worked together perfectly. A fantastic example of patience, endgame technique and never giving up. If you enjoyed this analysis, hit the like button, subscribe to 64 Squares Official and turn on notifications for more game-by-game coverage from the biggest chess tournaments around the world. Until the next game, keep playing, keep learning and keep enjoying chess. Thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next game.